Thank you so much. I got to shout out Eloquii. Eloquii is a plus-size brand, and they collaborated with Rihanna's makeup artist, Priscilla Ono, to make this outfit in addition to a few others. Anywho, everyone, hey. So I'm here with a lot of humility and a lot of gratitude. When I saw that Dolores Huerta was on the lineup, I had all the brain exploding emojis feelings. So I'm new to the world of girls' education and advocacy. I came into this work as a fat activist, an educator, and also a theorist who has worked primarily with adult women who are recovering from lifetimes of dieting and fatphobia. And I will unpack what fatphobia is in a second. I do a lot of things, but one of the things I do, for instance, is I take a group of fat babes into a retreat center, into the woods for a weekend, and we journal, and I teach them tools like boundaries, and we cry, and I teach them fat feminism, and I help them articulate what is happening to and around them. And we also jiggle and eat s'mores. And I think, on that tip, right, for a lot of people, women in particular, feminine people, a lot of us diet because we feel something is wrong, and we feel it in our bodies, in our guts, and we presume that we can starve it out by restricting food. In fact, the problem is not residing within us, it's outside of us, it's in the culture. And my work is about inverting the model. So shame is anger turned inward. I see my job as, turning that paradigm around. So this book, The Self-Love Revolution, began as an antidote to the explicit and implicit fat negativity in young adult and children's literature that address body image, and generally the lack of literature that centers girls of color at all. At its inception, it was about equipping girls of color, 12 to 18, with language to understand what diet culture and fat phobia are and offer them tools to combat that. And it explicitly, and this is kind of where the intervention really came in when we were originally conceptualizing this, it explicitly says there is absolutely nothing wrong with being fat. Fat people can and deserve to thrive. We are not failed thin people. We're just thriving fat people. Hey. And making clear that from every perspective, from a data perspective, from a sociological perspective, from a public health perspective, that the pursuit of weight loss leads to anxiety, depression, self-loathing, lowered capabilities to negotiate during sexual exchanges, a heightened likelihood of developing an eating disorder. It is resolutely not, in fact, leading to either lowered weight or, more importantly, overall wellness in the long run or in the short run. And this is something that's still a bit of a secret in our culture. So I think what's interesting to point out is that though fat liberation is a very radical politic, it is a data-driven politic also. And that's what's so astounding to people. Anyway, weight loss and food restriction are not the answers to the way that fat people are treated and seen in this culture. Ending bigotry is the answer to how fat people are treated and seen in this culture. This book quickly morphed into something bigger than this. I remember asking if I could take a meeting with one of the founders of the Radical Monarchs. And when I asked, we had a long meeting at having coffee down the street at Haddon Hill, which is a super cute place. I asked sort of, what is the most important thing I need to keep in mind as I write this book? And Marilyn said, girls of color's bodies need protection. And I would go on to talk to dozens of girls about the themes I was interested in including in the book, and protection came up again and again. I was visiting Wallenberg High School in San Francisco, and a number of girls of color shared that they felt that their bodies were not afforded the same sense of preciousness and protection that they saw their white classmates' bodies given from boys and men of all races. They also talked to me about how they felt surveilled, about how and what they ate at school and at home. I remember being at a library event, and there were two youth who talked to me during sort of the Q&A. One of them was a plus-size teenager who was fighting her school's dress code because she argued rightly that, one, it was sexist, and number two, it was fatphobic, because bigger girls experience adultification, and then of course if you're a girl of color, you're already experiencing adultification. How you are seen when you wear an exact duplicate outfit as a thinner person is very different. So her clothing, no matter what she wore, was always considered more provocative because her job in a fatphobic culture is to cover up her body. So she's fighting that. At the same time, another youth, same high school, a few seats down, a very thin, slender sort of idea of like an athletic, healthy young person. She was talking about recovering from anorexia as a teenager and living in a home where her parents are actively orthorexic. That is, her parents are obsessed with clean eating, clean food, and an athletic body. And while they were trying to support her in her recovery, they were also reinscribing fatphobia by saying, okay, we want you to recover, but don't gain more than 12 or 13 pounds. And it's this very terror of being fat that is at the core of eating disorders. Fatphobia and anxiety is the recipe for an eating disorder. So, these were stories that were coming up as I was doing research for the book. To back up a little bit, I kind of want to talk a little bit about my own background. I grew up a fat brown girl in a world and a culture, specifically that's fat-hating, racist, and misogynist. And so my life has always been touched by those intersections. And I think, growing up, I learned fatphobia in a very overt way. I'm abusing you because you are fat. You can stop the abuse by becoming a thin person. Very simple. That's how fatphobia was kind of taught to me. You can stop this, incessant emotional, physical, verbal abuse if you just conform to the thin ideal. And they said, all you have to do is stop eating so much and move a little bit more, and then you'll become a thin person. Again, data says that's not how that works. In fact, there was a report that came out recently, Huffington Post covered it, but the chances of a woman who is classified as overweight becoming a normal, quote unquote, normal size is less than 1%. That's pretty compelling, right? And so the fatphobia was very overt. The misogyny and racism, because I was born in the 80s, after second wave feminism, after a lot of racial liberation movements, it was coded. So I wasn't necessarily being called names because I was a person of color, but it was shaping everything around me. It was shaping the expectations for me. It was shaping how teachers talked to me. It was shaping how people saw my potential. And I got mixed messages about my own gender. I didn't have the tools to understand my gender or my own experience as a fat girl. I felt like a gender outsider. I watched thin girls get treated like they were dainty flowers by boys, while I was verbally and sometimes physically abused by those same boys. I could not fit into any clothes that were in the girl section. My thin friends expected that I always play the boy roles when we were reenacting the storylines in our favorite books. And there was never room for me to say, I don't want to be that. I don't want to be the boy. I don't want to be like the potato in the stone soup play or whatever. Somebody was telling me they tried to be the carrot, and the teacher was like, they have to be a potato. It was really messed up. So anyway, so for me, right, I was sort of living in this sort of liminal space, I felt, where I kind of had this, I was assigned female at birth, but all of the feminine gender markers were not there because I was fat. And in grad school, I ended up exploring that intersection. I really wanted to understand how fatness interacted with gender. So as a part of my research, I began to examine what fatphobia is. Can we go to like the fatphobia definition? Great, thank you. So fatphobia is a form of bigotry that positions fat hatred and negativity as normal, positions fat people as naturally inferior, and positions weight gain as a sign of moral failure and lack of self-control. It's really important to understand that fatphobia is not about the pursuit of wellness or health. It is about bigotry. It shares all the same criteria as any form of entrenched discrimination. I found that fatphobia has 3 dimensions, like many forms of oppression. There's the intrapersonal, how you feel about yourself. There's the inter, how people treat you because you're fat. For example, fat people experience romantic discrimination. There are many incredibly bigoted studies that even posit that being near a fat person alters your eating habits, and therefore you should avoid being around a fat person, just in physical proximity to a fat person. And then there's the institutional, which is essentially about all of the structures that normalize one kind of body and shut out another. We see this in the size of seats, we see this on airplanes, but it shows up in other ways that often people don't realize. So for instance, important medications like Plan B are not tested above 165, 175 pounds. So, I mean, this kind of rocked the world when this news came out that there were many people taking Plan B and it was completely inefficacious. They had no idea. Like, first of all, they either had no idea what the results were from taking the medication, or it was completely inefficacious after a certain weight. When we think about this in terms of the gender breakdown around like women and fatness, like 68% of US women are a size 14 or above, meaning that if around 70% of the population is hovering around the weight potentially, where Plan B becomes inefficacious. This is a really big problem and an example of institutional fatphobia. I found that people do not understand that attitudes toward fat people shared all the criteria of any other form of discrimination. I learned, and here are some other sort of staggering facts, I learned that fat women on average earn $9,000 less annually than their thin counterparts. They are likelier to experience medical discrimination and not be believed. And we know that women of color and people of color are generally less believed as well. I learned that it is legal to discriminate on the basis of weight in 49 out of 50 states, Michigan being the only exception. I learned that there are important medicines, as I mentioned, like Plan B, that aren't tested. I learned that many fat people blame themselves for their experiences of abuse, and that dieting and weight restriction are ways they cope and accept the blame for what is a cultural problem. I learned that fat people experience what's called minority stress, the ongoing experience of discrimination that affects the cardiovascular system, the immune system, mental health. I learned that fat people experience something many marginalized groups experience called hypervigilance. Less sensitive people often experience this as paranoia. Are you sure they said that? Are you overreacting? That sort of thing, right? A constant state of heightened awareness and expectation of microaggressions and abuse. The thing about hypervigilance is that even if you're only experiencing microaggressions, abuse, slurs once or twice a month, which is actually quite frequently, you are anticipating them 30 days out of the month, 31 days, 365 days a year, 52 weeks a year. You do not know when that abuse is coming, and it creates a heightened sense of stress that doesn't go away. And that state has incredible ramifications for the body. I learned that being fat is considered an already always immoral state. Likewise, racialized girls in our white supremacist culture are also denied that presumption of innocence. It affects how adults see fat girls. It affects how they see themselves. The intersection of fatness and racialization increases the likelihood of police interface also. So Black fat activists and writers like Kiese Lehman, who wrote Heavy, talks about how his childhood fatness combined with his Black masculinity created an entitlement he sensed that police had to touch and surveil his body. You can see in the films like the one I saw last night, Push Out, that this doesn't end with bodies read as masculine. One of the aims of the book became about telling girls of color, you are good. You are unconditionally good. And this sense of being good is something that trauma robs from a person. When a person is traumatized through racism or interpersonal abuse, they take on the responsibility of the terrible thing that's happening to them because that's how they stay sane. And this creates a lived reality in which you are constantly questioning whether or not you're a good person. This is very messed up, right? And a lot of people of color, a lot of fat people, a lot of marginalized people are walking around with this sense of like, am I actually secretly a monster? Am I actually kind of evil, right? These are things that come out of PTSD. In fact, the dedication of the book, the first page of the book says, for every girl who has felt ugly, wrong, bad, weak, you are beautiful, you are right, you are good, you are powerful beyond imagination. I looked to other bodies of scholarship in my attempts to understand the history and impact of fatphobia and to look toward a future of fat liberation. And this brings us to the first of two questions that I wanted to pose in this presentation. What can fat liberation and body positivity teach us about gender liberation and vice versa? In short, the answer is a lot. But I wanted to drill down on perhaps the most central component of fat liberation to really answer this. Oh my God, 1 minute. Snaps. Okay. I guess the shorthand would be that fat liberation emerged out of explicitly queer people of color methodologies and aesthetics. It was fat queers, many of them trans and non-binary before some of those words even existed. They were the people who taught me about fat activism. And I want to offer the question that they offered to me that really changed my life. Why would I settle for acceptance? They were not interested in acceptance or absorption into a culture that they saw as inherently violent and broken. They asked the question, what does it mean to succeed in a culture that aggrandizes misogyny, racism, hierarchy, homophobia, ableism? We are a culture without access to universal clean water. We are a culture that imprisons large swaths of our population, where most women experience sexual assault, in a culture that is homophobic, ableist, sex negative. We refuse to co-sign on all of that through the pursuit of acceptance. They didn't want a piece of the pie, they wanted to bake their own pie. And I'll leave you with, the pie metaphor, because I've run out of time. I wanted to ask one more question, but we're gonna leave you with that question. Like, how do you bake your own pie? Thank you.